everybody, and welcome back to Not a Sex Therapist. I'm your host, Changeling Neon, or Neon, as I am more well known. Today, we're going to talk about my experience with ADHD and sex, and I feel like this is something that more people need to hear about, and how it affects them and their partners. I was talking to my partner about it last night, and we actually had a conversation about this, because once you really look into it, you realize just how much it contributes, or how your illness contributes to it and stuff like that. But I do want to throw out my disclaimer. Everything that I say here, I'm not licensed or anything like that. I'm just somebody on the internet who has a lot of opinions and wants the room to talk about it and maybe spread a little bit of awareness. If you have questions about anything that I talk about, or are curious or anything like that, feel free to submit those questions to my form, and I will answer them more in depth on the next episode. Or you can go ahead and look it up yourself and find all the answers. And if I'm wrong, please feel free to correct me. That's what I want to hear. I want to hear that I have fucked up so that I can fix it. I don't want to be like, no, I'm always right. What do you mean? That's not gonna help anybody. That said, I do have chat live on these recordings. I always do, to give me their input, ask questions so that I can answer them right then and there. If you want to catch me recording these lives, I'm trying to record them on Twitch. If Twitch gets mad at me and tells me to stop, then I'll move back over to Fansly. But that happens every Monday morning. Couldn't tell you the time. I'll find that out later. Probably, maybe. I need to record an outro for my poor editor, but, I haven't done that yet either. But that being said, we don't have any questions today, so this might be a shorter episode. I haven't had anybody ask any questions or anything like that recently. So, like I said, shorter episode. Hopefully we'll wrap it up in a nice little bow, but this episode is mostly for me to yap, because I do feel like people need to hear it, especially if they or their partner has ADHD. Okay? I want to start with what I notice in myself. I mean, obviously that's going to be like the base for anything like that. So in my experience, I have always been super, super horny. I've always been super, super into sex and enjoyed a lot and everything else like that. After some reflection and thinking about it and doing a little bit of research, not a ton, not super in depth, but enough to kind of get the gist of what I wanted to find out. It is not uncommon for people with ADHD to also suffer from what's called hypersexuality, or in layman's terms, it's sex addiction. People with ADHD are more prone to having sex addictions of various different kinds, because it is one of the only consistent and natural forms of gathering all of those chemicals that their brains do not produce normally. Dopamine is the one, namely, in particular. Now, if you are somebody with ADHD, how many of you find that you have fantasies about, extended playtimes going on for a day, or being treated as a slave if you have a slave kink, or, an overstimulation kink, things like that? Part of that could be attributed to the fact that you have ADHD. Like I said, I'm no licensed professional or anything like that, but these are symptoms of these could be aspects of your mental illness that manifest themselves. If you are often seeking, or if you have a lot of those fantasies that make you feel good and make you, really make you want to run with the concept of sex and enjoying sex with your partner, I find that ADHD can definitely attribute to that, because we're constantly searching for that dopamine, and because our brains are already going, it already sets you up for this perfect storm of, as soon as you start thinking about anything, or if you even see anything or hear anything even remotely sexual that you enjoy, your brain kind of already starts going with those fantasies. It already starts running off. It already starts finding ways to implement them into your day-to-day life. It's looking for a way to release those chemicals and find those happy chemicals in its day-to-day life. It is not super uncommon. I don't have the actual data here with me, but I will look it up at a later point. But the connection between ADHD and hypersexuality is actually relatively high, considering that ADHD is a disorder that kind of that makes it so that your dopamine and I don't know about serotonin, but I will get a little bit more into that when we talk about my personal stuff, more in depth. But it's not uncommon for people who struggle with dopamine to end up searching it out in sex, because sex is something that is consistent and will always provide you with those rewarding chemicals. Even if you have ADHD, how many of you have picked up something that you normally really, really enjoy doing, or normally really, really enjoy, as far as like, you get that dopamine shot from it, you have a good time, you're enjoying it, and then you happen to walk by and you go to pick it up again, and suddenly that dopamine is no longer there. Sex usually has a very consistent output when it comes to dopamine, and because it has a lot of dopamine connected to it, it's easier to enjoy it. Now, that is not necessarily the same for everybody, and like I said, I'm going to go into that a little bit more depth when I start talking about my experience with it and everything like that, because not everybody is the same. Not every ADHDer is going to feel that same need or desire for sex. Not every ADHDer is going to be super into sex, sorry. On the flip side of that coin, people with ADHD often suffer from another symptom of their disorder called RSD. Those of you who do not know what RSD means, it means a rejection sensitivity disorder. People with RSD often take something, even if it's just like a little sign of, or let me rephrase, even if it's something like not an enthusiastic response, an enthusiastic positive response, ADHDers will often internalize it and pin it on themselves. For example, and we'll run with the sex example because that's what we're working with right now. If I tell my partner that I'm in the mood and I want to have sexy time, right? And my partner responds by telling me, "Oh, I'm sorry, I'm just not in the mood," or "I had a really rough day," or "I'm tired." Those are all super valid reasons to not want to have sex. But as an ADHDer with RSD, it's not uncommon for me to hear that and say, "Oh, it's my fault. It's my fault because I'm not attractive enough," or excuse me, or I'm not showing that I want it bad enough, or all these other things, right? And what ends up happening when you have RSD is you start internalizing that. So, and I don't even know that some ADHDers get to this point, but I know for me in particular, oftentimes what I will end up doing is I will try to evade the internalization by trying something different. For example, I will try to wear different clothing. I'll try to wear different clothes. I'll try to uh start being a little bit more overtly sexual. I'll try to be more flirty and more horny in my jokes and things like that, hoping that maybe she picks up on it. Um, and that oftentimes, if it just boils down to no, I'm still tired, or I'm not in the mood, or I have stuff going on, those things are not going to help me, because at the end of the day, it's not me that's causing the issue. It's that my partner just isn't in the mood or has stuff going on in their life. But if you have ADHD, it's very hard to separate those two things. Even if you know that that is a reasonable reason to not want to have sex, sometimes it's still really hard to think about it as it's not my fault. Right? And in some cases, I'm sure that it can be your fault, but a lot of the time, if you automatically jump to that feeling, that like that that yucky feeling that you get in your chest or your stomach whenever you're feeling just sad or depresso or just not good, I find that feeling is kind of addictive, in the sense that it's what we're familiar with. Many people who struggle with RSD are very familiar with that feeling of feeling bad or yucky, or feeling like they almost want to be comforted. And when they have that issue, it makes it even harder to accept when your partner says no, especially because, I mean, an RSD comes from, usually from what I understand, I'm going to have to do a little bit more research on this, from what I understand, RSD in ADHDers often comes from people telling them they don't like their behavior, or they're not doing enough, or the behavior needs to change, when that behavior is a symptom of their disorder. It is something that they can't change, or some of them, like myself, didn't even know was an issue until relatively recently. All that being said, whenever you end up with somebody who is hypersexual, like ADHD, who is already prone to enjoying sex a ton, and you couple it with RSD, you get this perfect storm for a mix of somebody feeling really bad about themselves for really enjoying sex. And that is not just an ADHD thing, that is a generalized, like, anybody can feel that way. For ADHD in particular, it kind of puts you in this really, really rough situation, because you know that you can't violate your partner's boundaries. You don't want to push them to do something that you don't want to do. But at the same time, when they tell you no, it's very hard not to internalize something like that. And it is hard, but the bottom line is you still need to try. You still need to try to get past that feeling of it's my fault, I should change this, or I need to behave differently, or I need to make them want me. And I'm going to go further in depth on my experience here in a second, but these are things that people with ADHD often struggle with. I know a couple of ADHD friends who also struggle with forms of hypersexuality. It's that rich mine of dopamine that you know always exists that draws you back towards it, right? So that's like the basic. That's something that's just ADHD and it's symptom disorder RSD, right? Now I'm going to talk more in depth about my experience with that and everything else that goes in with it, okay? I am somebody who I struggle with things such as ADHD, depression, maybe anxiety, but I'm not sure if that's just my ADHD manifesting and I can't get a doctor to actually listen to me, but that's not the point. ADHD, autism, depression, potentially anxiety, all of these different disorders or symptoms that I struggle with, in addition to a lot of sexual trauma that I have experienced over my years. Okay, a lot of those traumas are connected to my RSD. When I was with my partner before this current one that I'm with, they were not super into sex. Of course, I was already hypersexual, so that's already a recipe for disaster. And then there was a lot of what I felt was sexual neglect. When you couple that with the RSD, it blends into a lovely, lovely, messy mix of trauma and depression, right? So for me, I find that my partner often always tells me that she would love to take care of me if I'm in the mood, if I'm feeling excited and ready to go, and she wants to, and she's not necessarily in the mood, but I'm telling her I'm excited, I'm ready to go, and I want to go be horny. She will often say, well, I'm not in the mood to receive, or not necessarily in the mood to like do anything other than help you get off, even though she's being completely honest and sincere and is still willing to help me get to that point and help me get to that dopamine mine. It is very, very hard for me to tell her yes. Why? Because of my RSD. I have issues with if they're not enjoying it, if they're not enjoying it with me, if they're not by my side the whole time, then I'm going to be struggling because I feel that I'm not wanted or that me wanting to put out or have sex is not necessarily reciprocated. And that is something that it's sad because I feel that it's very hard to separate the fact that your partner, especially when you're long distance, it's very hard to separate that your partner may just not be in the mood to go into everything that goes into e-sex, especially e-sex. I feel like and when you're having sex with a physical like person, when somebody's actually there with you, when you go into sex with somebody who's actually there beside you, it's a lot easier, right? It's easier to go ahead and start kissing on each other, rubbing on each other, hugging and holding and cuddling, than it is to have to sit down, get yourself in a position where you're comfortable with, your phone, texting, whipping your dick out if that's what you need to do, or if you use like long distance toys. It's just a lot more setup. It's a lot more setup. It's a lot more, you have other things you're doing. One of the things that I personally struggle with is even though I may be like texting, doing e-sex and stuff like that, I very easily get distracted by social media, being on my phone, stuff like that. It's just a byproduct of being in a long distance relationship. If you struggle with something like that, then it makes asking for sex and doing anything with sex incredibly difficult because you're already sitting there thinking about you're distracted. You're not super into it to begin with. And so it's very hard to separate those feelings of your partner is just not in the mood or, doesn't necessarily want to handle themselves and yourself a lot of the time because of the RSD. My personal struggle with this is I know that my girlfriend is more than willing to take care of me. I know that she is. She has told me this time and time again, but it does not help or it does not help me get away from that idea in my head that it's because I'm not doing something that's making her excited. I will try writing horny things in an attempt to get her attention. I will start wearing different clothes or send her nudes or send her pics and stuff like that to make sure that she, to try to keep her interest up. And if the bottom line is not me, it's that she's not in the place where she can have the sex right now or do anything with it, I have a very hard time not internalizing it. That's not her fault. That's just a byproduct of my issue. So, by rounding back to what I was saying before, if I tell her that I'm in the mood and I want her help to help me finish or get to that point, get to that dopamine reaching point, I still find it very hard to ask. That is because of a myriad of the other issues that I have. I talked a little bit before about how I'm I'm undiagnosed, but everyone's pretty sure that I have some degree of autism or autism. Part of the struggle that I feel is I can't tell when my girlfriend is being sexy with me or if she's showing interest or not. So, as you can imagine, if I can't tell if she's showing interest, that's definitely going to kick up that RSD, right? Because if I can't tell and she is 100% actually trying to tell me that she's in the mood and wants to, wants to be into me, and I just can't fucking tell and I'm not picking up on her cues, then who's to say that she's going to pursue? Who's to say that I'm not going to see this and assume that I'm not doing my part because I just can't pick up on the cues that are telling me, oh yes, I'm ready to go and I'm in the mood and I would love to have some spicy time with you. Right? Do you guys see the problem? Do you see where all of these issues start to culminate? You're already struggling with the fact that you're hypersexual. You can't fucking tell whether or not your partner is telling you whether or not they're in the mood, or you can't tell if you're doing enough to tell your partner whether you're in the mood. The thing is, right, it's to somebody in your own head. You feel like it might be super obvious that you're telling them that you're in the mood, but to your partner, they may not have a fucking clue, right? This is something that I personally really struggle with. There have been plenty of times that my partner has given me the opportunity to say, oh yes, I'm ready to go. And I just fucking bypass it because I can't tell that's what she's saying, right? And I know I've talked about it before. You should always ask and be explicit about the fact that you want sex. And in all honesty, you should. I personally struggle with that because of my ADHD, my anxiety and such like that. All of these things culminate to a much bigger struggle when it comes to sex and everything to do with it. It's a lot harder to identify when you or your partner is in the mood or ready to have sex when you can't even tell what a yes means. I know one of my problems is my girlfriend will tell me explicitly, I want to help you. I may not be in the mood to be touched, but I am in the mood to help you get across that finish line, and I am in the mood to play with you. I just am not in the mood to be reciprocative of any kind of attention like that. Right? And me, I will automatically take that and say that is a no. That is an automatic no because she's not invested, she's not interested, and I don't want to push her past her limits, right? Which is not what she said. And that is a symptom of my RSD. It is a symptom of my autism. It is a symptom of my trauma. There's a lot of things that blend into it that make it an awful, awful mess. And this is why I felt it was so important to talk about it, because I know I'm not the only one with a myriad of problems that is hypersexual, especially if you're ADHD. This is more than likely going to resonate with you in some degree. And I just want everybody to know it's okay. Like, it's not ideal. It's certainly not ideal. I think that the problem with hypersexuality comes when you are unable to respect your partner's boundaries. For the longest time, and I'm willing to admit it, for the longest time, I feel that I may have made my partner feel as though she didn't have a choice a lot of the time. And I don't mean that like I was trying to force myself on her or anything like that, because that would be cruel and wrong. I think that because of my RSD and my lack of knowledge on how to handle those feelings, my partner often felt really bad a lot of the time about not being able to satisfy my needs and desires. Thankfully, she stood her ground and I was able to respect it, but I feel like she definitely felt guilty because she could not live up to what I needed, especially when I was younger. I used, and this is not uncommon either, I was using sex as a coping mechanism. That's not uncommon for ADHD people to do either. That comes from emotional dysregulation. It is a lot easier to regulate your emotions when you're being like pumped full of dopamine and focus on the happy chemicals that you get from having sex, right? So for a lot of ADHD people, they often run to sex as a coping mechanism. It's unfortunate, but it's the truth. It's easier to get off and handle your problems that way, hit that release rather than sitting there and facing your problems and dealing with them. So you end up with somebody who has ADHD who's already prone to those activities that already bring them a lot of enjoyment, dopamine, all that good stuff. And then you have somebody who has trouble regulating their emotions and getting them under control. And you end up mixing that up to find somebody who is super into sex, who likes to have sex all the time, that uses that sex as a coping mechanism to get away from or express or release those feelings that they've been building up all this time. I know for me, whenever I'm feeling like really bad, if I'm having a depressive episode, and I noticed this about myself this last month while I was having my depressive episode, I often found myself turning to sex more than I do normally because it is one of the only ways that I know 100% will guarantee that I feel better. Not just about like my mental state, but about my body, about the way I feel about myself. It is one of the only ways that I can 100% guarantee that the dopamine is going to be there and make me feel a lot better about myself. That being said, that doesn't necessarily mean it's a healthy coping mechanism. I know I've talked a little bit on the podcast about um sex addiction and how it can really ruin your relationships and everything like that. Sex addiction, and I'm realizing also, in addition to that, porn addiction can be very, very damaging things. Porn is something that I know I've talked about. I'm going to do an episode on that, but it is such an in-depth, enriched thing that it is much bigger than I had the time to compile when I was last going to do that episode. But I do want to kind of touch on that and relate it to the topic at hand. Sex addiction and porn addiction kind of go hand in hand, right? Obviously, one is more physical and the other is more, chronic online kind of behavior. Any kind of addiction will end up sapping your savings. It will end up impacting the relationships in your real life. It will end up impacting your day-to-day life. You might be addicted to porn if you find you can't go more than a couple hours without going and looking through porn. You might be a sex addict if you notice that it's taking priority over like your relationships with even just your friends or your partner and stuff like that. I know when I was younger and I was super depressed, like I went through a really big, bad mental depressive episode when I was in like middle school and high school. It was really, really, really rough. It was one of the worst times of my life, but through that time, I noticed also that that was when I was at my horniest. Why? Because I was using it as a coping mechanism. Because again, it was one of the only things that I knew for sure with 100% certainty would bring me those happy chemicals, would make me feel a little bit better about myself, would all that stuff, right? It is something that kind of creeps up on you as well, especially if you are somebody with ADHD. I know I personally don't consider myself a sex addict, but I do think that I was once upon a time a sex addict, or at least a porn addict. There were times I would go multiple times a day, and that was all I could think about. Like, legitimately, it got to a point where whenever I was doing anything through my day-to-day life, I would dissociate and start fantasizing about sexual topics because it was easier and it was an easy escape, right? And so it's just a recipe for some unhealthy coping mechanisms, a recipe for not great relationships between you and your partner and your friends, all that stuff. When your porn or sex addiction starts to take precedence over plans that you made with friends or plans that you made with your partner, or if you often find yourself thinking, I would rather just be having sex right now, I think those might be little red flags to look out for, but maybe not. I mean, everybody sometimes has those moments where like, man, I'm just super horny. I'd rather be doing that than sitting at the social function. You know what I mean? But I think it's important to understand where it stands as far as you and your daily life stand, and if you feel that it is in any way kind of like getting in the way of what you would be doing on a normal day-to-day life. Don't be looking at porn at work if you have the choice, or if you have the choice. Don't be looking at porn if you can help yourself at work. Make sure that you are focused on your task at hand, all that good stuff. So, that being said, depression also, I meant to say this earlier, but if any kind of like mental disorder that isn't being properly treated or coped with, you are more likely to be at risk for any kind of addiction that includes drugs, drinking, sex, all of that stuff. Addiction is something that preys on somebody that feels as though they have nothing left, or they have nothing better, or this is like the life that was put out for them. That's why I said earlier, I often find myself more drawn to sexual acts when I'm not feeling good, when I'm in a depressed, helpless place, because it is my coping mechanism. It's an easy way to forget about everything going on in in favor of an experience that feels a lot better, that's a lot more satisfying, that makes all of that negativity go away. It's a very dangerous thing to have to look out for, and looking out for your relationships with others, I feel, is a very smart way to do it, very good way to do it. And just make sure that you're paying attention, right? Like that's the hardest bit, I feel, especially if you have something like ADHD. If you don't realize that it's something that's creeping up on you, if you don't realize that it's something that is like one of the, you just have to be careful. You just have to keep an eye on it. And that's not to say that you can't enjoy yourself or anything like that. I'm not trying to tell you, oh, you have to be celibate, you can't have sex, you can't no, that's not what I'm saying. What I'm saying is, like any other form of entertainment, it has to be done in moderation, and make sure that you're paying attention to the fact that it's not completely ruining your relationships with other people, your relationships with your partner, your relationships with your family. All of those things are very important. And if the sex or, whatever ends up taking precedence over that, I think you're starting to tread down a very dark, dangerous path. I'm not done yet, but I am going to open the floor to the chat if they do have questions. I'm going to keep rambling, but if they do have anything that pops in, feel free to ask. Like I said, I don't have any questions on my form. Nobody has submitted anything since the last time I did an episode. So we got plenty of time to talk. You guys have plenty of room to ask questions, and I will do my best to answer them. Let's talk about I do want to talk a little bit about my trauma. I know I touched on it earlier. My trauma is often all connected to that RSD. That RSD where I feel that I'm not being seen or heard. And when you mix it with the fact that many people in our day and age have a very negative body image, right? Some people out there, yes, they're very confident in their bodies and they're comfortable in their bodies and they're happy in their bodies. I feel like a vast majority of us are not. And that's sad. It is very sad. And a lot of that comes from the way we're raised and the environment that we're raised in, and, movies, TV, all that good stuff. It all comes down to, if you have a very negative body image and you already suffer from ADHD or RSD or even depression, those feelings of RSD end up compounding. They compound and compound and compound, and you just feel worse and worse and worse. And so you start running towards somebody who will just give you what you want. Your standards are lower and lower. At least this was my experience. I mean, obviously, I guess that's the title of the episode, isn't it? My experience with it. My standards for that type of thing were lower and lower and lower. I had an ex who was like super into the hardcore BDSM, and I just could not. I'm not super into that. It's not for me. It really pushed my boundaries pretty hard, and I just didn't say anything about it because at the time I was stuck in this headspace that was all that I could get. This is what I deserve because this is as much as I could ever hope to get in a bedroom sexy setting. And so I shouldn't complain. And that's not a healthy way to look at it. And I'm sure I'm not the only one who's had that thought before. I know that I personally have occasionally, like, if I'm not getting something that I want in the bedroom, or if I'm not getting something that I feel that I need, sometimes, or even if I'm not necessarily in the mood, sometimes if my partner is in the mood, I will tell myself I need to say yes, because if I don't know if I'm ever going to get this again. Now, if you're somebody like me who acknowledges that sex can be an addiction, especially for somebody with ADHD, if you're mindful of it, if you know it, and you know that sex is as big of a part of your personality as it is for me, that's a very detrimental way to look at it. If you're looking at it with that idea that I'm not good enough to deserve what I need, or that my boundaries to be respected, then you're in a super bad place. Not a good place to be, not a good partner to be with if they can recognize that, and or if they recognize it and still push forward with whatever is happening. If you are somebody that enjoys sex, if that is something that you like and you like doing that activity, then there's nothing wrong with enjoying yourself. The problem comes from when you're unwilling to allow yourself to experience those good things, and then you're just taking it, right? Because then you're left feeling unsatisfied, used, abused, just unpleasant, just overall very unpleasant experience, you know what I mean? All of those things culminate. And I guess the bottom line here, like with my experience, is I'm just trying to get out there that sex addiction is a real thing, especially if you have ADHD. You're very prone to having it if you have ADHD. It's important to keep your eye out for it. I know, like I said, have been somebody who I feel has fallen into that category before of sex addiction. There are still times where I think maybe I have that problem, and I've found that addiction is more likely to pop back up when I'm not feeling well, when my mental state is doing very poorly, and that's how I run to cope with it. It tells me that I already am like that's a pre I'm 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 ripe for the addiction. That's the bottom line. It's more prone to happen to me because I'm already in a situation where that's something to worry about, right? The bottom line is it's rough, right? If you are somebody with ADHD, just ADHD, like excluding the myriad of problems that I talked about before, like depression, making it so that you're already looking for something that makes you feel better, you feel empty, you don't enjoy anything else, you start running to sex because you know that's what makes you feel good. If you have anxiety and it's hard to ask and you have RSD, the RSD kind of agitates the anxiety a little bit because the anxiety is already thinking if they reject me, like I already feel bad about my body. What am I going to do? The RSD just agitates that because you're already going to internalize whatever, like if they give you a no, you're already going to internalize that as a personal flaw, a personal attack on you and your being. Even if the other person didn't say it in a mean way or anything like that, if you struggle with RSD, it's hard to not internalize that sort of thing. So you already are sitting with anxiety, which is going to make the RSD worse, or vice versa. They're bouncing off of each other. If you have issues like I do, and if you're a little bit on the autistic spectrum as well, and you have somebody who might be interested in you or willing to accept, or you are trying your best to make it clear that that's something that you enjoy, but you're embarrassed and you don't feel good about it because it mixes in with the anxiety and trauma and stuff like that, then you're already like, it's just a fucking struggle. Like sex and ADHD, I love sex to death. I love it a lot. It's one of my favorite pastimes. I love researching it. I love learning about the personality types and everything. I love learning about how people's, traumas are connected to their kinks and how to deal with it and stuff like that. I love learning about it and I love the activity. Feels good. Makes me feel good. Makes me feel good about myself. And so that being said, it culminates into just a fucking mess, right? I know I've talked about it before with my trauma in particular, which is also aggravated by the RSD and vice versa. It makes it very, very hard to not think that everything, every no, every little anything that is not absolute 100% enthusiastic yes when it comes to sex with me is not. If that anything that's not that, I will automatically start to internalize and think about how it could be my fault. What am I not doing in order to give them in order for them to look my way? And for the longest time, and I think I've talked about this on the podcast in the past, I think I have dealt with people in the past who often exploited that aspect of me. Somebody who felt that they had nothing to offer but sex, right? Not only is it a coping mechanism for me, but I often feel like if I'm not giving sex, then I'm not feeling loved or I'm not doing what I need to do, right? People will take advantage of that. That feeling, that lack of understanding of what I was going through and my mental struggle with it, my active struggle with it, everything, like people will take advantage of that. And people did indeed take advantage of the fact that I was more than willing to put out in order to feel love. And so that is another aspect to all of this that makes it even more difficult. It's unfortunate, but it is the reality of my situation in particular. And if others are out there suffering with something very similar, I do encourage you to kind of sit down, talk with your partner, try therapy as well. Try to identify whether or not you're using sex as a coping mechanism or if it's just a fun time. And don't get me wrong, if you like sex, there's nothing wrong with liking sex, right? Like I said, you just have to pay attention to whether or not that is interfering in your day-to-day life. Because if it is, then I highly recommend you start looking into potentially getting things diagnosed, potentially getting some help with it, and looking to your partner to make sure that they understand, what you're going through and are willing to help you with it, right? Make sure that you guys talk about why you feel that you are turning towards sex as a coping mechanism. Tell them that I know what I like to do is if somebody notices my tone change or if they think that they've hurt my feelings or whatever, even if they have, if I feel that it was something that actually hurt me and I feel was wrong and it was an injustice to me, I will tell them that straight up. But if I know it's just them saying something like, for example, something that I personally really struggle with is like getting feedback, right? Any kind of feedback immediately, any kind of critical feedback immediately will trigger my RSD, right? It takes a lot of effort for me to separate the fact from, the fact they gave me a critical review or critical, like, things that I can improve on. It takes a lot for me to separate the fact that they're just trying to help me with my RSD thoughts of I'm just not good enough, right? Those are very common issues I struggle with. If somebody gives me any kind of critical feedback, I have to take a minute and step back because I will immediately jump right into defending myself. It has happened before. It has happened in the past and happens even in my day-to-day life. I have a really bad habit of immediately jumping in to defend myself, even when somebody else is trying to help. And it is something that I am still trying to work on. I still have to work on it. I still have to take a minute to myself a lot of the time and say, that's not real. That's just me. That's just me being, obnoxious. I'm just having my RSD episode. If I feel it, what they said was legitimately wrong and they're actually like, what they did actually hurt me on a deeper level, and it's not just my brain trying to tell me that I'm being attacked, then I tell them that. But I have to separate them saying, oh, well, this section here could be improved, or you should take this out. I have to separate that, the fact they're trying to help me, from the RSD of it's not good enough the first time, you shouldn't have tried this, you need to give up, that kind of thing, right? Whenever people notice that I'll like take a minute or calm down or get a little quiet when things like that happen, I usually just tell them, hey, it's just my RSD, like you did nothing wrong, don't worry about it, don't apologize, because it's not your fault, it's just my RSD. It's not anything that they did wrong, especially if they were polite about the feedback, they weren't a jerk about it. Turning around and just being like, it's just my RSD. I know that you didn't mean anything by it. I just have to work through the feelings. Like, I'll get back to you. That kind of thing, right? So, being an adult is understanding where you went wrong and how you can fix it and how you can improve. And sex addiction and ADHD, that is just as much a part of that journey as anything else. Understanding that, sex might be a coping mechanism for you. That's totally reasonable as long as you're doing it responsibly, as long as those things are not impeding on your relationships, as long as they're not taking precedence, as long as you're being mindful about it, if you're not hurting anybody else or yourself, then you're okay. Unless, you guys consent, but that's a completely different topic for a completely different episode. So, all in all, I mean, my journey with ADHD and sex has been a super, super long one. I've talked in the past about how when I was younger, I mean, I was already, like I said, I don't know what the word is that I'm looking for. I can't remember off the top of my head, but I was predisposed. That's the word I'm looking for. I was already predisposed to having this type of addiction when I was younger because I was suffering from depression, because I had unmedicated ADHD that I didn't know that I had, all of these things. And so I did indeed fall into that trap of sex addiction, I feel. Obviously, it's not diagnosed or anything like that. It wasn't diagnosed, but it was something that I felt that I did actually struggle with quite a bit. And so that being said, it wasn't until I want to say even relatively recently that I started to learn that the symptoms that I was exhibiting were symptoms of sex addiction. It wasn't until I started with my current partner that I realized that that's not where all my worth lies, and that's not how you make a relationship work. Going through and realizing that not only is sex not a shameful act, it is a natural one, but it is also like any other entertainment or any other activity. It is something that has to be done in moderation. As long as you are taking care of your relationships and your obligations, then it's okay. And if you have ADHD and you're struggling with sex addiction too, then talk about it with your partner. If you feel that you're kind of falling into that bubble and you feel like you're worried about it, and your partner, ask for support, ask for help, and then maybe potentially go get some therapy if you feel you need it, or some diagnoses or whatever you need, as those are very important. And the takeaway all of this, bottom line, if you have ADHD, you are more likely to end up with a sex addiction of some kind. porn, sex, I mean, any kind of addiction, drugs, drinking, all of that. You are more likely to end up with some kind of addiction because it is consistent, because it is a good way to get that dopamine when nothing else is working, especially if you are coupled with depression like I am. That is a coping mechanism that you know is going to make you feel good, especially if you have a partner that's willing to take care of you. Keeping your eyes open for that kind of thing is super, super important. Keeping your eyes open for any signs of addiction, making sure it's not getting in the way, all of that's super important. And make sure you're self-aware enough to understand where you're standing. I think that me realizing this last month that sex is a coping mechanism, especially when I'm super deep into my depressive episodes, was kind of a turning point for me. It's a lot easier for me to look at sex for an easy, helpful, an easy way to feel better than to have to sit and acknowledge that I'm not feeling great. But sometimes that is the first step that you have to take in order to getting better. And that's the hard part, right? And that's not to say that you can't have sex. Like I said, everything in moderation. If you like to have sex and your partner and you are for it and you have sex, you go at it like rabbits almost every day, totally fine. As long as you guys are meeting your obligations, nobody's feeling like they're being exploited or used or hurt, and they feel cared for. As long as all of those boxes are ticked, you're doing just fine. Have as much sex as you want. Just make sure those boundaries are met and you know where you're at and you're self-aware. If nobody in the chat has any questions, I think that that's where we're going to wrap up. This was a super short episode. I know it was. I know it was super, super short. Those of you who were wondering where the hell I went, I'm very sorry. Like I mentioned a couple times, I had a couple of depressive episodes, this last month. So the podcast slowed down. Not as many episodes were released, but I'm glad you guys stuck with me. Glad you guys are here. Thank you for listening to me. And if you have any questions or anything you want me to talk about on the podcast, any topics or anything like that, feel free to submit it to the forum. You can find it on the podcast website, on my card, or underneath, or wherever the description for this episode is for you. It might be, if you're watching it on YouTube, it'll be beneath. Spotify, it'll be somewhere around. You'll find it. I believe in you. Thank you again for coming. If you want to find out or engage in more of my content, I stream every day on Twitch at about 10 a.m. MST. I don't know what. No. Yes, maybe. I don't know. I don't know what time zone I said before, but it'll change because I'll do my outro with my editor later. So, if you want to catch me live doing other things, playing games, whatever, feel free to check me out there. If you want to see what's up with me, you can feel free to join my Discord, which I think I have on my card. I'll link that later. And then follow me on Blue Sky if you want any of my little updates, my little Neon's thoughts updates. That's where I post a lot of those. I'll see you guys all next week. Thank you so much for listening. Bye-bye.